Nos da muchísimo gusto darle la bienvenida a uno de los prospectivistas y futuristas más famosos a nivel mundial, Andy Hines. Hemos reconocido su trayectoria durante mucho tiempo y sus aportaciones. Estamos en un momento muy significativo para la prospectiva. Y realmente nos da mucho gusto que una personalidad como Andy Hines fortalezca la integración de nuestras redes, que esta vez convocan a su presentación. Tengo el gusto de comentarte, Andy, que están presentes la Red Mexicana de Futuros, el Seminario de Estudios Prospectivos en México, el Instituto de Estudios de Futuros México, la Fundación Barro Sierra México, la World Future Society México, la Red Iberoamericana de Prospectiva River a nivel región latinoamericana, el CEP del Cuyo en Mendoza, Argentina, la consultoría Anticiparse de Argentina, la consultoría Proceres de Colombia y la Fundación Ética Visionaria de Costa Rica, así como la Vicepresidencia Latinoamericana de la World Future Studies Federation. Andy Hines se unió a Joseph Coates de Coates and Harrod como consultor futurista en 1990. Pasó una década como futurista organizacional con The Kellogg Company, como gerente senior de tendencias globales y posteriormente en The Dow Chemical Company como líder senior. Regresó a la consultoría prospectiva como director gerente en Social Technologies Innovaron y simultáneamente se unió al cuerpo docente de la Universidad de Houston como conferenciante para el entonces programa de posgrado en estudios futuros en 2005. En 2010 estableció su propia firma de consultoría prospectiva llamada Hines Site, que continúa operando hasta la fecha. Después de la jubilación de Peter Bishop en 2013, fue designado como el actual coordinador del programa y ahora profesor asociado del programa de posgrado en prospectiva estratégica en la Universidad de Houston, impartiendo cursos en estudios de futuros y sirviendo como asesor de estudiantes de prospectiva. También es presidente fundador, director ejecutivo y miembro de la Junta Directiva ya desde hace mucho tiempo de la Asociación de Futuristas Profesionales, conocida como APF. Ha escrito sobre estudios de futuros, perspectiva estratégica, métodos de investigación prospectiva, el rol de los futuristas organizacionales y el panorama del consumo. En México hemos aplicado sus escenarios como macroimágenes. Ustedes podrán ver que nos estamos ahora apoyando del traductor Google para que la conferencia de Andy sea más visible. Al final de la presentación, eh, él va a hacer también unos ejercicios y estaremos en la galería completos. Le agradezco mucho, mucho a Rosario Santander el que nos haya vuelto a conectar con Andy y pues bienvenido, Andy. Adelante, por favor.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I love the opportunity to speak to fellow futurists, especially ones that I haven't spoken to before. So it's nice to do this. Um, so the talk is based on a book that just came out in February, Imagining After Capitalism. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is I teach a class called World Futures. So as you can imagine, we study different aspects of the future of the world. And every semester, the students pick a book about the future, about the future, might be the economy, technology, whatever it is. And been doing this now for about 10 years. And one of the things I noticed is how few books about the future use a methodology of future studies or foresight. It's amazing. What we find is very often it's smart people saying smart things about the future, but not using a methodology. And so that, as a futurist, that offends me. So I decided that, that would be one thing someday that I would like to do for a book. So I've done a couple of methodology books. So this is a book that uses futures methodologies to talk about the long-term future. If we can go to the next slide, I'll give you the second reason that I wrote the book. And many of you, I guess, I hope, may be familiar with this classic book in our field, written in the published in the 70s by Fred Polak, called The Image of the Future. It is, I believe, it's the second book about the future that I read. So it was one of the very early ones. And I read it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is brilliant. And for those who haven't had the pleasure to read it yet, the basic idea that Polak brought to us was that the great successful societies or civilizations of the past, one of their common features was they had a guiding image of the future, a positive guiding image that helped that society um, move forward. And when he was writing the book in the 70s, he talked about how today or back then, we didn't seem to have that guiding image. And now it's 50 years later, and I believe we still don't. We really don't have that positive guiding image as a society, as a civilization of where we want to go. So happily, when it was time to kind of do the next book project, and I wanted to write a methodology book about the future, but actually talk about the future, I went right back to Pollock and said, this is where I'm going to look, if you will. I am going to look for guiding images of the future and see what is being said about the longer term future. And the way I positioned it is after the current capitalist system uh, fades away and is replaced. Okay. So that's the two reasons we want to write a good methodology book about the future. And also, we need to fill that gap of lack of clear, positive guiding images to our future. Plenty of books about collapse, plenty of books about the problems, but not a lot about the solutions. So if we go to the next slide, please. One of the things that I want to be very clear about is this is a long-term view that while I started this work back in 2012, and like all good ideas, it came from my students. And we were talking about like what to do for our annual spring gathering. And someone said, why don't we look at what's happening after capitalism? So this is back in 2012. And we did the meeting, and kind of what I just mentioned, we saw a lot of problems, but not so many solutions. So I started looking for solutions. And one of the things, the first, I don't know, 5 years or so, I found a little bit here and there, but maybe around 2017, a little bit before the pandemic, I started to see a lot of writings and ideas coming about that, well, maybe late stage capitalism, maybe capitalism is done. And it wasn't so much ideas about what was next, but there's been in the last 5, 7, maybe even 10 years, there's been a lot more written about the decline of capitalism. So if you're doing your horizon scanning, I'm sure that you've seen this. So nonetheless, so even though there has been more interest maybe in what's next, um, we're still a long way from it. And so we will use our little handy Three Horizons framework to kind of set that. I think we're probably 20 years, maybe 30 years away from this kind of transition. Now, of course, it won't just happen overnight. It'll take a long period of time, and at some point we'll go. I guess we've made the transition. It's not like we know it happens on a certain date, but we're already, if you will, I think we're already on that pathway. And about 20, 30 years from now, we'll feel like, yeah, we've actually transitioned into something new. And of course, my goal is to say what might that something new look like? Okay. So in terms of the three horizons, just to kind of set, what does that timing, what does that pathway look like? Right. So the first horizon, the current system is declining, right? There's problems with the current system. And as that current system declines, there'll be a whole there, and there are a bunch of ideas, mostly to fix the current system. How do we reform capitalism? How do we make it better? That's what actually, when I did my research, that's most of what I found. How do we fix it? My conclusion now, and it's not how I started the research, but my conclusion now is we probably can't. But there are some ideas about what might be that third horizon or this new system. And what I tried to do was find what have people said about a new, post-capitalist system, and to put them together into a set of images. I ended up finding three. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And as Guillermia mentioned, we will have an opportunity for you to kind of interact. I pose some questions. We'll have some little breakout activities to kind of break up the routine and give you a chance to see what you think. So if we could move to the next slide, please. All right. So good futures work. Of course, we do our horizon scanning, and now I've been doing it for, I guess, 12 or so years now. And I probably have 1,000 signals of over 1,000 signals of change in my scanning library. One of the things that we do at Houston that you may also do here, but just in case, I'll mention the domain map is basically a way to say what are the, where if we want to identify change, the domain map says where do we look for it. So over time, I've developed a set of categories to kind of guide that search for change, right? So sorry, it's obviously it's pretty busy, and I didn't want to go into too much detail here on this, but just know that there's a pretty systematic way to look for those signals of change. And it's not just in the economy; it's in the society, it's in the technology, as we know, right? The economics, as well as the environment and the political realm. So we look for change all across the whole spectrum, not just in the economic world. And I've used a couple of different for those who like the tools. We started out using a scanning library called Digo, but that's been kind of not being maintained anymore. I tried Factor for a while, and now I'm using something called Raindrop. So if you're one of those people who likes tools, we found that the Raindrop is a nice little scanning library tool that you could use. Okay, so we did the scanning. We found the signals of change about what might change, what might be the world after capitalism. If we could go to the next slide. Another major piece of research was, of course, tried to find books, either reports or mostly books, who had either done a significant, treated the topic, either an actual whole forecast or parts of it. Like some books talk just about work, maybe some may have talked just about different kinds of technology. But I tried to gather what I thought were the best books about the talking about that after capitalist future. And donut economics is one that's been pretty popular. I think you might have heard of. There's been folks who've written about post-growth, of course, the fourth industrial revolution, and so on. So I probably looked at 150 books in some detail, and these 50 here that I analyzed a little bit more thoroughly. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you something of, how do you analyze a book about the future? So I mentioned Fred Polak, who had written that book called Images of the Future, and he provided some ideas on, what is a good image? Like what should we look for? And a more contemporary view, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Dr. Wendy Schultz. She taught a course for us at the University of Houston, maybe in 2016 or so, on images of the future. And she developed a lot of ideas around, again, how do you identify and analyze an image of the future? And so I kind of put those two pieces together and maybe added a little bit of my own my own in there, a little sprinkled in a few of ingredients from me, and came up with this image analysis template. And for each of those books that I mentioned on the previous slide, went through and analyzed and said, how did the image that author created, how did it answer the basic questions around an image? Now, some of these, of course, time frame makes a lot of sense, right? What are the key drivers, But what was very interesting to me, and Pollock did this as well, is how important the personal appeal is in a successful or useful guiding image, right? So you see values is a really important thing. What are the guiding values of that image, right? What is its emotional, aesthetic, and spiritual appeal? Again, personal, right? And then literally a category called how do people fare in this guiding image? So I thought that was a very interesting thing that this, again, a successful guiding image is not some just abstract concept speaking to the whole, I mean, to the whole civilization, but it also gets to that personal level. And to me, that's the kind of thing where people they see that image, they feel that, and they say, "I want that. I am motivated by it. It attracts me." And I think a successful image has to have that sort of personal appeal. The people are willing to, if you will, sacrifice for it, right? So anyway, that was one of the common elements that we found, and some of the images do better at that than others. But I think that to me, that was a really, it took a while we tried different variations of what that template might look like. But, I think I kind of like where this is netted out. Obviously, we can always improve it. So that's one of the things that came out of this research that's a little bit different and new. Okay, and that's offered to the public, I guess. So let's move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I started this, as I mentioned, in 2012 at the behest of my students, right, about the future after capitalism. And I would say at the time, I was pretty neutral about cap. I didn't, neither favor it or dislike it or like it. I just, yeah, whatever, right? Didn't have a strong point of view. And as I got into the research, over the years, I started to think, ooh, there's some problems here, right? And when it really struck home to me, so we have one of the courses in our curriculum that we teach in this every spring is systems thinking, and we have a whole course on it. And for me, at least, the key principle of systems thinking, right, is that a system's behavior, what a system produces, derives from its structure. And that means that, like, you can change the people, and that may not solve the problem if you don't change the structure. So the structure produces what it produces. And so capitalism, if you will, as a system, is structured to produce what it produces. And it's been doing it for, the last several hundred years, right? And, what it produces is growth. And for a good portion of time, maybe up until the last recent era, we were okay with that, right? I mean, it was producing growth. Now, of course, it wasn't producing it equally, and you can see one of the key features of capitalism, it is inherently going to produce inequality. It's what it does. And I would say up until recent time, we recognized that, but we were kind of okay with the bargain because it also produced growth. Now, again, not everybody agrees with that, but it's kind of like we took the bargain, right? Now, of course, that growth is creating the environmental stress and problems that we're all witnessing. And now we're like, wait a second, it's growing too fast. It's not growing equally. And it's also producing the third thing, the technology that, well, and some may say some benefits to that technology. It's also producing technology that is so powerful that it's also raising some questions about, how do we want to handle that? But that's what it does. And so it really strikes me that, the best we can do right now is we can adjust the rates a little bit up and down, but we can't change what it does. That's what it does. And I think what's different as we move into the future is we say that what capitalism produced for the last few centuries, we were generally okay with. But now it just does not align with where we need to go in the emerging future. It's no longer a fit to the context. Now, I think we could debate that, and maybe we'll have some of those discussions. But I mean, that's the general assumption of the book, that it just doesn't fit anymore. And I wanted to say, to be very clear, I take the position that it's that we do not, if you will, demonize the opponents. Or, sorry, demonize the supporters of capitalism. In other words, there are some scholars who have said, capitalism is bad, it's evil, it's wrong, it's caused all these problems, and if you support capitalism, you are bad, evil, and wrong too. And I say, let's not do that. Let's just say, capitalism has done what it's done its job, and let's move on and look forward. Let's not get into the good and bad, and if you believe it, you're somehow a bad person, and that idea is out there. So I try to take a neutral stance on that so we can have discussion. Because if it's good and bad, right and wrong, it's really hard to have a useful discussion. Okay. So we're not going to be against capitalism. So if you are, it's understandable. And I get the argument that capitalism has done a lot of not so nice things, but I don't think it's productive to kind of get into that whole pointing the finger thing. So let's move ahead. So we go to the next slide, please. All right. So what if in my own language, in my own words, like what's the problem right now? Right? If you say we are. And what I did not come up with this. Carl Polanyi did a wonderful book that basically made this point that we were living in an economy, not a society. Robert Reich, the former U.S. Labor Secretary, had rephrased that a little bit more recently, and I love that idea. And it's like we have our whole life is backwards. Instead of using economic growth to live better, we're living in order to produce economic growth, right? It's backwards, right? And so I think as we look to a different future, as we look to a post-capitalist future, we need to switch that goal and say, how does the economy make our lives better? We're not put on this earth just to serve an economy. And I think that's kind of one of the things that's just happened, right? It's kind of happened to us very slowly. And it's almost like now we sit and go, wait, how did this happen? Why have, why have we ended up in this kind of a circumstance where our whole life depends upon how useful we are to the economy, right? And I think that's kind of crazy. So, anyway, what should we be doing instead? There is the idea of the after capitalism. Oh, thanks, Jan, for putting in Robert Reich. Yes, he's doing a lot of interesting work now in the post-capitalist world. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. All right, so before I get into the key drivers, I wanted to give you a heads up that we will pause in a little bit, and I will give you a chance to discuss amongst yourselves in small groups. Which of these drivers do you think are the most critical in terms of the most important to shifting the current system to something new, right? So that's going to be the activity that we'll do in a little bit. So I'm going to describe them first, but I'll be interested to see what you as a group decide. They're all important, but are some more important than others? So it'll be interesting to see what this audience does. So let's go ahead. Wait, it looks like the slides might be, if we can go back to the regular deck there. Yeah, because we'll get to the activity in just a bit. So first thing, just to be clear, so we're all talking on the same page. When I say drivers of change, the way at Houston, we say that a driver it's a collection of signals, trends, issues that are kind of thematically related. And they come together and they're driving us into the future. Okay. So that's we have seven of these. It was really hard to come up with seven. I will tell you that the one that I ended up taking out that was probably the hardest was longevity. So I thought it's a little bit more speculative, but I could imagine the future being much different if we are living a lot longer. But anyway, we wanted to keep it simple, so we stayed at seven. So let's go to the next slide. Let's start with shifting values. My favorite, I think well, we'll see at the end. I don't want to give away the story, but I think at the end, we'll see that I believe shifting values is probably maybe the most influential driver, but that's just me. Okay. You also might notice for those who are familiar with the STEEP acronym, social, technological, economic, environmental, political, that I'm going to go through the drivers in the order there. So this is a social driver, shifting values. So kind of set the stage here. One of my previous books was on the future of shifting values. And if you haven't come across the World Values Survey yet, it's time to do it. It's actually it's based in the U.S., but it's a global project that's been running since the 1970s. And every 5 years, they've been asking questions about individual values. And then, they come back 5 years later. And so we've got 50 years worth of data that says, how are people's values changing over time? And it's in over 100 countries. So it's a very global data set. And so what I was able to do in some previous research was to use that data to find these three types: traditional, modern, postmodern. And then now I came up with, not I, but some other researchers came up with a fourth category called integral. Some of you might be familiar with spiral dynamics, and spiral dynamics is one of the groups that came up with this idea of a new category called integral. Okay, so what's the short story on shifting values? What the data says is happening over time is the direction. Well, let's first do the types. The first type, traditional values, basically says our job in life as individuals is to know what's right and know what's wrong and follow those rules and not ask too many questions about it. Follow the rules. Do what you're supposed to do. Okay? That's the first type. Globally, somewhere around 20-ish% of the global population, maybe 30%, 20 to 30%, depending on where you are. All right, the next set, the modern value says, wait a second. If I work hard, if I achieve, if I grow, if I compete, I can change my position. I don't have to just stay where I am. I can achieve, I can grow. And so that second set is called modern values is about achievement, victory, competition. Again, much different than the first, right? And that's somewhere around 30 to 40% of the global population. So right now it's the biggest one. It's the biggest set globally. Okay. The next set that emerges postmodern says, wait a second. It's not only about victory and competition. What about the health of the group? It's really important to participate, right? Participation is good. Ecology is important. We need to pay more attention to the environment. We have to develop our communities. We need to think about holistic health. So you see a whole different set of priorities that are more about overall health of the community and away from that competition of the individuals. And that's around 25% of the world, roughly, right now. And then the final one, which again is not in the World Values Survey data, but there's some, I guess, independent sources that speculate maybe 3% of the global population, pretty small, but it's the newest one. And the integral value says, wait a second. While what's really important here is how do we make a difference? And what's really important for our purposes here in after capitalism is it's the first type that says, you know what, there isn't necessarily a right answer. So let's kind of set that stage. Traditional folks will tend to believe if only everybody else was traditional, the world would be great. Modern beliefs, if only everybody was modern, the world would be great. Postmodern, if only the world was, postmodern would be great. So each type really kind of fights for its particular. And the integral is that first group that just says, no, that's not, we need all of that. And I think that's really important for the kind of shift that we're talking with after capitalism. We need that mindset shift to that more conciliatory, right? And right now it's a very small percentage, but what the data does suggest is over time the traditional and the modern are probably at their peak and declining, and the postmodern and integral are growing. Right? So that's what the shifting values is. So there is some, in a sense, the modern values are the ideal fit for capitalism, right? Growth, achievement, victory, number one. That's perfect for capitalism. And that's, again, it's at its peak right now, starting to decline. Postmodern says, ooh, we don't like that. We want equality. We want justice, right? That's not aligned so well with capitalism. And then I think, the emergence of the postmodern and integral is one of the reasons we're seeing movement to doing, let's do something else. Okay. So that's the first one. So some of you may say, I believe that's the most important shift. All right, let's go to the second one, number two. Technology. Well, that's pretty obvious, folks. I don't have to tell you too much about that. I don't know if you have this game in Mexico, but I've been pushing it in the US. Every time you hear somebody say AI, you have to take a drink because every conversation now, AI, AI, AI. So if you do that, you're going to probably need somebody to drive you home because it's such a dominant factor in our conversations today. Everybody's talking about it, and I think it is important, of course, but perhaps perhaps a little bit overblown, but nonetheless. That second the second driver of after capitalism says maybe technology is going to create enough wealth that we don't need that sort of capitalist dog eat dog competition anymore because we've created abundance, right? Possible? Of course, the challenge that technology acceleration has is unfortunately most of that wealth goes to right the top 1%, right? And so the question is, would that abundance be distributed more equitably? But nonetheless, is there momentum to say that technology could produce abundance? Yes, it is a possibility, right? Okay. So that's number two, the most obvious one. Technology is driving us, creating new opportunities, possibilities for a post-capitalist world. Let's go to number three, inequality. I don't know if any of you have the commitment or maybe the craziness to read Thomas Piketty's book on capital. It's about this thick, 1,000 pages. But, I really wanted to go in and make sure that when we talk about inequality, we really understand why is this happening, right? And it goes back to, I think that point I made earlier about it's a structural feature, right? It's just what capitalism does. And what Piketty, when he went through his analysis, he came to pretty much the same conclusion that this is what you're going to get. And so, um, again, I think historically we've been okay with that, and I think in the emerging future we're not okay with it. Not everybody, right? Obviously, there's a debate about this, but I think in the longer term, the momentum will favor, I think, an adjustment in how we think about inequality. Not today, but we have 10 to 20 years, right? So that the inequality argument is, it's a structural feature of capitalism. It's not going to go away. We can make it a little less unequal, if you will, but that's what we're going to get. And I believe we're not going to accept that. So that's number three. And some may say that is going to drive us to change capitalism. Okay, let's go to number four. Automation and labor. And it's very much related to number two, right? The technology acceleration. And it raises a very interesting question. Now, I wonder if any of my fellow futurists here have made this statement along the lines that I used to make a lot. I used to make that the goal of an economy or a society should be to have full unemployment rather than full employment. Why should we? Why don't we create a world in which we don't have to work? Shouldn't that be the goal? Now, I can tell you when I used to say that 30 years ago, people looked at me like I was crazy. And then 20 years ago, they looked at me like I was a little less crazy, but still 10 years ago. But now, in the US at least, we had one of our presidential candidates. Now, he wasn't a very popular candidate, but he ran on a platform of universal basic income. And I got to tell you, if I had tried to say universal basic income 10 years ago, people would have looked at me like, So when we think about the possibility of, AI and other automation technologies replacing jobs, I say that's actually a good thing. However, and everyone's saying, however, right? That means we have to develop a social economic policy that, if you will, provides wealth for those who we don't need to work anymore. Now, that's, of course, the big challenge, right? But if you will, could we imagine a world in which machines and software did a large share of the work that needed to be done? Sure. And why not? As long as we distribute wealth to to the rest of us, so to speak. And I will say that most of the ideas that I found about that sort of post-work future did not suggest that people would not have things to do. People will still do work-like things, but it's those work-like things, doing those work activities is not how we get access to food or housing, right? We do those things because they need to be done, and we use the abundance to, I guess, if you will, fund our basic needs. So to me, automation and labor is, I think, I favor automation, provided we make the smart social choices to make sure that people can survive. So that's number four. Let's go to our number five, stagnation. Now, we talked about how capitalism, what it's really good at, what it depends on, is producing growth. Now, one could argue if you look really closely at what we're calling growth these days, you might raise some questions about, are we even really growing today? Now, certainly the GDP figures will say we are, but if you look at what is the actual growth, you might start to scratch. You might start to scratch your head and go, well, wait a minute, is that growth? Is that really growth? So, I mean, that's a whole, we could have an interesting discussion about that. But um, one might argue that, because we have been growing for so long that we have, we're reaching some limits to what we can actually do anymore in terms of new growth. And so we've kind of, if you will, we've resorted to creating false scarcity and called that growth. We've taken almost every activity of human life and made it into a monetary thing. Now, I'll tell you, I've been guilty of this too. We did a project for a client and we proposed parenting as a service. You could outsource parenting for a fee. Shame on us, right? But we did it. Yeah, we proposed it because, and that's the nature of capitalism, is everything should be a financial transaction. And what this driver says is we're getting to the limit of what we've monetized just about everything. What else can we do? Which suggests maybe we need a different system. Okay. That's number five. Let's go to number six. Of course, this is the obvious one around the environmental stress caused by all this growth. And I think for me, one of the I don't know, beneficial. I don't know if there's beneficial impacts of a pandemic, but at least one of the things we learned from the pandemic was because we literally had to stop economic activity for a while during the pandemic. What we saw is a very clear evidence that the ecosystem, the environment, started to recover. We actually saw it because there's always this, well, we can't stop growth now, but no, we can. If we make that choice, we could actually improve the conditions. So we actually have some evidence that slowing economic growth would, in fact, help to restore. Now, I think we could also have another discussion about like how, is it too late or how far gone, and there's a lot, I must say, there's a lot of troubling, data about, you know, is the best thing we can do now is manage the decline, right? Because we've grown so fast that the environment really can't recover. However, so I think there are a lot of folks who will say that's the number one reason why we've got to get out of capitalism because it's the growth imperative that capitalism drives for is literally destroying the environment. Okay. Okay. So I think it's probably an easy argument that you're familiar with. If you're wondering what the picture is, we did a project for the Forest Service in the U.S. and we found that there's an architect in Italy, Paul, I forget his name now. Stefano Boeri, and he has about a dozen of these, but they call the vertical forest, where they build nature right into the buildings, which is kind of an interesting concept. Okay, so let's go to number seven, driver number seven. So hopefully you've been taking notes. You're ready to talk to your colleagues about what you think are the most important drivers. Now, it's just for fun. I mean, there's nothing we need to do with it, but it'd be interesting to think, what do I believe is the reason we might go to after capitalism? So this next one, it's definitely U.S. centric, but I suspect you may be seeing similar kinds of arguments in your situation where it's basically saying that in the US in particular, if you will, the left and the right are about the same size, roughly, right? The left is actually a little bit bigger, all that said, right? But it's a relatively similar in size, and the two groups are just banging heads and nothing can get done. Right? We just can't get anything done. And the reason I say ineffective left, in the US situation in particular, the right has been very smart. I'm not sure I agree with them, but they've been very smart about how to create views of the future, whereas the left in the US has been not so effective. And I would count myself as more of a left, for sure, a left supporter, but it's just been very, very poor at developing images of the future. And obviously, you can see the mess we're in right now. So, without getting too deep into those details, one of the things that we found, the major challenge that the left, at least in the US, has had is we call it the ideological purity test. Whereas when somebody proposes an idea on the left, there's a group that will say, "Oh no, you don't pass the test. It's not pure." And in order to build an image of the future that's going to attract a lot of people, you have to make some compromises. And the left has just been unwilling to compromise, and again, in the US. And so anyone who tries to propose a guiding type of image, the left will say, you've not passed the ideology test. And therefore, there's kind of a vacuum on the left. Okay. Again, I'm not sure to what extent you would say that's true, but we've seen it in other countries, but it's certainly pretty prominent in the US. Okay. So now let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to give us maybe, let's see if I'm on. Oh, good. We got about 10 or 15 minutes. So what I was thinking is we might just do breakout groups of, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 people at random. I don't think we have to assign them any particular way. And in that time, what I would ask you to do is a group, see if you can come to some consensus or just, kind of take the temperature of the group and see, do some of these drivers seem more important to you than others if we are going to make this shift to after capitalism? So I believe that there's also a set of worksheets that maybe if we attach the worksheets to the chat, that people can bring them, or maybe you've made arrangements for how people can see those 7 drivers. But if you could take maybe 10 or 15 minutes as a group, see if you can come up with a ranking, and then when you come back, we'll chat about it a little bit. Okay? Does that seem right? Reasonable? And then we'll move on to part 2. Okay. Thanks. And I can see Jan, thank you for translating that in the chat. Appreciate that.
Andy, I think we need to, I would like to say in Spanish, the instruction that you just gave, please, again.
Sure.
What are we supposed to be doing in the groups, please?
So if you have the, well, here, let me attach the worksheets just in case that might help. So the worksheet has an instruction and it basically says, when you look at the 7 drivers, rank them from 1 to 7 and what you think are most important to enabling that shift to after capitalism. So see if there's any group consensus on which ones are most important.
Ok, entonces lo que vamos a hacer en los grupos es un orden de los impulsores de cambio que contribuyen a un movimiento lejos de capitalismo. Número 1 siendo el más importante, número 7 siendo el menos importante de los impulsores que nos mueven más lejos de capitalismo. No sé si alguien que habla español nativo, materno, quiere mejorar mi español. I'm just asking to see if any native speaker would like to improve on my instructions.
Right. And I attached the worksheets in the chat just in case. Maybe people already have them, but just in case, then you can pull them off the chat.
Okay.
But it's for all, there's 3 more for later on.
¿Están entendiendo bien la instrucción para el trabajo grupal? 10, 15 minutos nos van a poner en grupos. ¿Mm? Okay, nobody seems to be complaining.
Great, thank you.
So you're ready for people to be put into groups? Yes.
Please, yes, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
entonces la persona encargada de ponernos en grupos, él está listo.
Bueno,
Who's the person?
habíamos dicho en un primer momento que ya no se requerían los grupos, pero por eso no habíamos puesto en acción a Melanie otra vez. No sé, Melanie, si se pueden hacer los grupos de una vez.
Oh, sí, no hay problema.
Bueno,
Ok, yo le voy a explicar a él que estás en eso, por si acaso él quiere decir algo más, ¿les parece?
sí, mejor, por favor.
Okay. Andy, they're just putting us into groups because more people have come in. And so we need to take a little bit of time, and just in case you have anything else you'd like to say.
No.
No? Okay.
No, it's okay. Just go ahead and put them into groups.
Okay.
And again, we're just trying to see, is there any consensus, or is it maybe everybody split up, but is there any consensus on which ones seem more important?
Ranking the drivers. Guillermina, ¿cómo usan ustedes la palabra drivers?
Fuerzas de cambio.
Yo estoy usando impulsores, pero no sabía si
Es fuerzas de cambio, estoy de acuerdo.
Sí,
Fuerzas de
fuerzas de
cambio,
cambio.
fuerzas de
No,
cambio.
disculpe
Ok,
por la interrupción. Ya están listos los grupos. Voy a abrir las salas.
Sí,
gracias.
adelante.
Mhm.
Gracias. Sí,
Going into groups,
te tocó en la 1.
going into groups.
Sí. Ok, Rosario.
Yo me quedaré en la sala principal por la transmisión en vivo.
Sí, gracias.
Ujú.
Sí, yo estoy viendo dónde quedé. No me encuentro. Y está.
Oh, es que como usted estamos en la misma cuenta, nos quedaríamos igual en la sala
Ok,
principal.
ok, me quedo acá, claro.
Mm,
Ujú, ok, y Rosario también. No todos han entrado a las salas, ¿verdad?
no, no todos.
Ok.
¿O quiere intentar unirse? Y ya
No,
luego yo me salgo.
no, faltaba más, mejor acá desde acá. No hay problema, al contrario, gracias. Es ahorita muy importante que nos eches la mano en esta parte. Y luego también Rosario no tuvo. La 6 está casi vacía. Van a tardar más en integrarse que en la discusión. Bueno, la 5 está saturada, la 6 ya casi vacía. 4 bien. La 3 también tiene muy poquitos. Y la 2. Ujú, ok. Los drivers. Mm, No sé si alguien estaba tomando el tiempo.
Ah, yo lo estoy viendo.
Ah, bueno,
Ajá.
gracias. Sí,
10, 15 minutos, ¿verdad?
sí, de 10 a 15. Parece que tendremos que dar 15 porque tardaron en integrarse, ¿no?
Sí,
La 5 es la única que está
completa.
saturada. Y Andy quedó en una, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Ah,
I noticed that poor Cynthia was all by herself, a group of one.
ajá.
Maybe she requested that. So I think
Yes, yes. Ajá. Quería decir algo y.
Sí.
sorry about that. What do you think? About 5 more minutes, we start back at 1 o'clock?
Sí, 5 minutos más.
Okay.
5 minutes. Thanks.
Oh, algunos no se están uniendo porque están en una actividad, por fuera y no pueden unirse.
Ah, ya te comentaron. Ujú. Andy, there are some people who is working now and working and you and hear you. And then they come to union in the groups. That's why don't say
Okay.
don't I hear.
All right.
Mhm. Okay. Creo que sería el tiempo, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo andamos de tiempo, Melanie?
Faltan 5 minutos.
¿5 más? Porque hace rato Andy dijo que solo 5 más. Ah,
Es que yo estoy contando 15.
sí,
Ah, entonces sí, a las 12:02.
ajá, sí. Todavía 5 más. Ujú. Pues, ok.
Can anyone peek in on the groups to see if they seem to be doing okay? I always wonder, sometimes maybe the chat is better than the groups, but do people generally like to do groups on these meetings?
Yes,
Okay.
I think it's better.
Okay.
Ujú.
Oh, sí, y me permite decir algo al YouTube. Para las personas que nos están viendo, si gustan escribir su escala en el chat del live de YouTube, pueden hacerlo.
Sí, muy bien. Sí, los de YouTube Alive es difícil que se junten. Tenemos muchos afuera, ¿no sabes? Melanie,
¿Afuera?
sí,
¿De dónde?
tenemos ahí en el YouTube Alive.
Mm,
¿Hay muchos conectados?
por lo pronto solo 4.
Ajá, ok. Bueno, es, está bien, a ver si se animan a contestar ahí. Ujú.
Do you want to bring them back now? It's up to you, but it's 1 o'clock, but up to you.
It's time?
I think so.
Yeah. ahora sí, es tiempo.
Ok, voy a cerrar los breakout rooms.
Sí, van a la sala todos.
Ujú.
Right.
Se cerrarán en 40 segundos.
Ajá. 40 seconds.
Okay.
Un error mío, pero yo estaba diciendo que cuando mencionamos lo de deuda externa, yo también pienso que hay que mencionar neocolonialismo, porque para mí los procesos son muy conectados, ¿no? Entonces, primero vienen en el periodo de colonización, sacan todos los recursos naturales, después nos dan préstamos y nos cobran la deuda y ahora estamos en la neocolonización y pienso que todo eso está conectado.
Muy bien.
No sé quién va a reportar de nuestro grupo.
¿No se pusieron de acuerdo en el grupo?
No, no nos dio tiempo, pero propongo que sea Christine, no sé si ya está en
Perfecto,
el grupo.
Cristina,
Hussein,
perfecto, no, Cristina,
¿sí? Cristina.
Cristina.
Mayra
I'm
en el
here.
grupo nuestro. Mayra.
Estoy.
Mayra Campos, ok. Mayra Herrera,
Mayra Herrera.
sí, muy
Saludos,
bien.
querida Mayra. Thank
Ajá,
you, Christine.
un abrazo, Mayra. Ajá.
Okay.
Perdón,
Welcome.
es que ya.
Okay, everybody's just deciding who's going to report on their group work.
Okay.
And who's going to be on the front lines?
It's okay, it's okay.
The front lines moving away from capitalism.
Well,
Well, I don't know. I didn't hear the very last part, how we agreed on the last part of the ranking. The very last one, we agreed on the left being ineffective, but then the 5, 6, 7.
We
I
talked
did
about number 4 was the external debt, but we also wanted to include the whole issue of colonialism and neocolonialism because they're related. You take the resources and then you charge us for the loans and then you come back with neocolonialism. So it's a vicious circle that's moving us away from capitalism. Well, that's my opinion. And then what other ones were we missing? As long as we have some time waiting for what's ¿qué más?
values. We were missing values, and the value change, no values being changing, and stagnation. We had stagnation, and I think automation.
But we put automatización with technology, number 3.
Yeah, they were right after each other. That's true.
Yeah, okay.
So stagnation, it's either before or after that, or I don't know where you want to put it. And the
What-
value, I don't know.
What about the rest of the group? What do they say?
Maybe the values is a bit slower in Mexico to change at least, or I don't know the rest of Latin America. How you guys feel?
I think that we have to include values and work on them, even if it's very hard.
Yo me
Right.
declaro insolvente.
Ajá.
Me declaro insolvente. No entiendo nada, pero no importa.
No importa,
Me
sigues
tiempo de
adelante.
leer. Bueno,
Y Norbert. Ok, entonces Cristina, tienes número 5 y número 6, ponlos en el orden que tú consideras y ya está. Concepción has a question, Andy.
adelante,
Eh,
Chita.
En nuestro grupo llegamos a una conclusión unánime, pero solamente de 4
Mayra.
puntos. En el valores 1, en tecnología 4, en inequidad 2 y en automatización 5.
Ok. Ajá.
Is that
Conchita.
translation okay for you, Andy, or do I need to put it in the chat?
I got it.
Okay.
Ok.
If
Conchita
I
Olavarrieta.
would like to make a statement, if y'all let me. I could translate. I just will need a little interval, right in between dialogue. Um, so I'm just offering, for all the Spanish speakers. Aquí, buenas tardes. Podría hacer una traducción también, nada más que requiero ahí un pequeño intervalo ahí de, pues de tiempo ahí de para que me puedan decir. Y
Señor, nosotros hemos tenido varias reuniones, el equipo de traducción.
Sí, sí, sí.
Entonces,
Precisamente él es
por
parte del
favor.
equipo. Ajá.
Ok. Entonces, como
Ok. Bueno, Conchita Olavarrieta levantó la mano. Hace como media hora, ¿verdad, Conchita? Buenas tardes. Adelante, por favor, Conchita. Uh, uh, uh. Ya se me fue Conchita por ahí.
um,
Ajá.
Conchita, are you around here? We would like to hear your opinion.
No, no, no. Oh,
she speaks English
she's
perfectly,
not
so
here.
speaks both languages.
She's not here. Ok. Ajá.
The,
Bueno, ¿le podrías
is
preguntar,
not
Sash,
here.
cómo lo vamos a organizar? ¿Cómo nos vamos a organizar?
Um, how 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 do y'all want to organize ourselves?
Guillermina, no puedes tener una persona que inglés no es su lengua nativa, que está poniendo las cosas en inglés. Lo siento mucho. Por eso yo estoy aquí, para poner las cosas en inglés, porque es mi lengua nativa. ¿Ok?
Sí, sí.
Por
Sash
Well,
nos
favor.
iba a ayudar desde el principio, nos va a ayudar también a la traducción, pero bueno, sí, ahorita nos ayudas tú. Adelante. El doctor Alarcón, adelante, por favor.
Yes, thank you very much. And also say hello to Andy. I was in your course in Houston, so very nice to meet you again. Uh, very happy to be in your class today.
Thank you.
Well, in our team, we were team number 2 with Maria Elena from Colombia. We have an interesting discussion. We came together to put in the lower place or one of the lowest places in effective left. I ranked it at 7 and Marilena at 6. So we were very good in that, very with the same opinion. However, we realized that we had very different views because climate change was put as number 1 by Maria Elena and I put it on number 6. So we say, well, we have a problem here. But anyway, at the end, I think after discussing, we concluded that inequality is number 1 and stagnation number 2, and that is as far as we got, no, on our discussion because of the timing, no. So what we can contribute is inequality 1 and stagnation 2. That's it. Okay.
Terrific. And again, I think it's an interesting way to have the conversation, right? Just to say, by ranking, it makes you kind of think of your assumptions, and in the end, the answer isn't so important, but the discussion is hopefully useful.
Of course.
Piensa que la forma de de esta forma de rankear las factores de conducción, es una buena forma de interpretar cómo nos hace sentir estos factores conforme al nuevo avance de este mundo posmoderno.
Okay.
Gracias.
Okay. Okay, shall we move? Shall we move on? Is there a group that needs to report out that we haven't heard from yet?
Yes, our group hasn't reported yet.
Please.
Christina?
Hi, sorry, yes, I'm here. Our group was basically divided, but not divided, but we were debating on climate change and putting inequality and climate change to the very first place, basically because we think they are very relevant for the region. And so we had those in the first two slots. And then we were a bit, I guess, uncertain how to move on. But we put like technology as on the fourth place. And fifth, I think, automation, which goes hand in hand. And then I think changing values, which takes the next slot in our ranking. Then, or did I miss? I missed, I think, the debt and neocolonialism, which Jan was mentioning, right? So that might be a bit, I don't know if it's ahead, maybe in the third place, I don't know, ahead of technology. I don't know how you thought about that. And what we have left is stagnation and the left being ineffective. I think in Latin America, or at least in Mexico, that's the least relevant issue. So that's how it looks like. So from climate change, inequality, technology, automation, there's the debt situation, stagnation, the economic parts. And there is the social part, the values, and then left being kind of the least, I guess, least uncertainty for now. That doesn't mean that it's not that there is no uncertainty, but I guess that's how we agreed. Is that right? Do you guys want to comment anything?
Good. I think it's good.
Okay. Well done. Oh, thank you. I did want to say thanks to the group for bringing up the colonialism, neocolonialism. I think probably the hardest question of this whole research was the question of the North and the South, if you will, because obviously the state of capitalism in the richer countries is different than in the developing countries. And I tended to focus the work on the developing because I think it's going to collapse there first. Right. I think that the capitalism is near the end, closer to the end, and the U.S. is probably the best example of that, where it's really reaching the edge of its limits. But to think about, I mentioned earlier the redistribution of wealth problem, right? I mean, obviously that is a huge factor, and a lot of that is going to be, if you will, from the north to the south. But how that happens, obviously, is a huge question we need to think through over the next decade or two. So thanks for bringing that into the mix. All right, let's if we go back then, so the second part, and I'll leave a little time for questions at the end if we want to just chat in general, but I wanted to now talk about the images. So if we could go ahead and advance the slides. So we've hopefully we believe the case that we're moving to something different, and the three images that emerged. So again, they came from the research. My job was to say what did the research tell us? And they came into these three different themes. And as you suspect, they kind of sound similar to some of the drivers. So the circular commons image was basically the environmentally driven image. And one of the reasons that I thought the ranking exercise might be interesting is it would say that different people will be motivated by different types of things or different types of issues. So some folks who believe, like I think somebody said, we had a strong advocate for climate and carrying capacity being the most important issue. Well, that person may be most attracted by the circular commons image. The second image, the non-workers paradise, talks about the post-work future. Again, there may be some people who are in that sort of social, political, labor force arena who believe that is, that is a very motivating and compelling future for them. And then the third one, tech-led abundance, was there is a group, and I think we all know this, there's a group that is very convinced that technology is going to save us all. Now, maybe not everybody believes that, but there are folks who do. And I did find several fairly well-developed visions or images of that sort of technology-driven future. So what I was hoping in putting together these three different images is that maybe one of, there's something in there that will appeal to a pretty wide group. But I suspect many futurists will say, well, don't we need a little bit of all three? And I would agree with you. But putting out one image, that I don't think that's, I would rather that people came to that conclusion on their own. So those three images emerged from the research. So let's talk a little bit now about what they look like. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to come back and talk about the three horizons just for a minute. We talked about the three horizons earlier and say, so that first horizon, which we're in today, is the capitalist system, right? That's the current system. And we say over time, as that's declining, we will see alternatives emerge in Horizon 2. And one of the things that we've done at Houston is we've looked at different archetypes or patterns of change. So we borrowed or built upon the great work that Jim Dator did at the University of Hawaii and took his patterns of change and we've applied it to different types of systems, right? One pattern of change is collapse, which Jim had in his set. So I must say, even though my goal here was to produce positive guiding images that we can work towards, but as a sound futures work, we have to also acknowledge it may not turn out positive, right? And we have to acknowledge the possibility that it could collapse. And so I don't treat them in much detail, but I do say, here's what collapse might look like, right? So one was overshoot was the environmental collapse, class warfare was the social and political collapse, and then AI going bad was the technology collapse, right? The other pattern, which is maybe one of the things that we do a little bit different from how Jim put it together, but I think it's compatible. New Equilibrium says one of the ways we get to the future is we start to transform, but then we get if you will, we get afraid and we kind of go back. So we advance and then retreat. And it kind of takes this looping behavior. So we advance, we retreat, we advance, we retreat, and we keep kind of looping, and we get to that transformation future gradually through several loops. So, if you will, the pathway to after capitalism, the collapse pathway says, the whole thing, the system collapses, and a new system emerges from the collapse. The new equilibrium pathway says, no, it's more gradual and we're going to start to change and then go back and then start and but eventually we will get to that transformation future. Now, what's interesting, we did some research. We went and looked at past sets of scenarios, like scenarios from the past that talked about the future. And we tried to identify what was the more common path from the present to transformation. Was the more common path collapse to transformation, or was the more common path new equilibrium to transformation? So if that makes sense to you, if you had to guess which was the more common path, would you say collapse? And you can maybe put it in the chat if you don't mind. Would you say it was collapse, or would you say it was new equilibrium, the loops? Anyone want to take a guess?
Bueno, está pidiendo ahí, por ejemplo, está hablando ahí de los horizontes, ¿no? Ya después del mundo capitalista, ahí va a haber, bueno, en el primer horizonte se puede ver un nuevo equilibrio o un colapso. En el de colapso ahí se puede integrar ahí como que la inteligencia artificial ahí tome el mundo, casi casi. Y en el nuevo equilibrio, pues es una más de sustentabilidad, ¿no? Una transición gradual. Y en el de colapso, pues es caos. Entonces, aquí es donde, bueno, entonces aquí es donde el doctor Andy Hines ahí busca, es nuestra opinión acerca de que, pues, ¿qué pensamos nosotros que es la tendencia de las nuevas órdenes? ¿Se basan por colapso y caos? ¿Surgen del colapso y caos? ¿O se desarrollan gradualmente? Ahí sí lo podemos compartir en el chat. Muchas gracias.
Okay.
Can I ask something? Is it okay to ask something?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, I don't see there somehow. I mean, I see cross war, but not like global war or like war among major powers. And now it's kind of getting tense
Yeah.
at many fronts. And I wonder about that. So the changing international world order. So I'm kind of wondering. It feels like it's that interaction among countries. What do you think about that, or where would you put on this scheme?
Sure. I think there's, unfortunately, there are many routes to collapse.
Okay.
And, you know, whether it's economic, I mean, the class war was probably the closest to that. But yes, could it be more economically driven? Absolutely. Could it be technologically driven? Absolutely. Competing about who's, yeah. So I think there's many, yeah, it absolutely could be a different approach, a different route to collapse. Yes. Good point. Go ahead, Sergio, is it?
I
Sergio.
think, go ahead, Sergio.
Y gracias. Bueno, las grandes transformaciones no han sido, digamos, así de colapso, sino que han existido las transiciones. Por ejemplo, simplemente podemos ver qué forma se adquirió cuando los terratenientes eran quienes eran los que estaban al frente, para que después diera paso precisamente ya a quienes llamaron, digamos, la fuerza emergente de la burguesía, que fueron básicamente los comerciantes y que tenían el control de los medios de producción, que es lo que venimos viendo hasta ahora. Entonces, y después, si teníamos primero campesinos, luego obreros, y fue dando esa transformación, ahora hay que ver cuál es la clase que está surgiendo, que está generando los cambios, las transformaciones, con qué nuevas ideas para, por ejemplo, hacer hincapié en las cuestiones en las que, a su parecer, hay que transformar, como sería básicamente, algunos dirían que sería básicamente la forma de distribuir la riqueza para que hubiera mayor equidad, pero desde luego tiene que ver con el cambio de ideas, el cambio de valores, ¿no? Que son sistémicos y a partir de ahí se genera un conjunto de acciones que van alineadas, se van dando de manera paulatina, o depende también de las resistencias que se pongan, ¿no? Pero sí podemos ver, con esto termino, ver la posición que está adquiriendo, digamos, Estados Unidos con Donald Trump a la cabeza, los cambios que está haciendo para hacer una recomposición geopolítica y lo que están haciendo otros gobiernos que se están alejando, por ejemplo, sobre todo, diría yo, concretamente, de las políticas, por ejemplo, de distribución a través de programas, a través de esto que le llaman, digamos, populistas, ¿no? Que ya no están, digamos, en el mismo orden de ideas, en donde básicamente, pues lo que estábamos viendo que causa mayor malestar, pues es la concentración de la riqueza en pocas manos. Gracias.
Yeah, so Andy Hines, if you'll let me. So he's basically just saying that the all greats transformations don't happen or don't surge from collapse, but the changing values and the resistant movements that evolve throughout time. And he set an example with the current political climate in the U.S. and how the far right is really controlling America right now,
Mhm.
and driving a new or maybe just shedding light on a whole movement that's
Yep.
been kind of suppressed in current times. So yeah, that's basically what can I say.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much for that. That makes sense. So my sympathies are with those who said collapse in the chat. When we did the research, we all guessed it would be collapse. What the research showed, and I wouldn't say it's definitive research, but at least it gives, it was the looping pattern was much more common, which fits in with, I think, what Sergio was saying, that we found that the by far the looping pattern. And so we're not quite sure what happens after collapse. It would be an interesting research question to say, if you will, what happens after collapse? But it does not appear to lead, at least immediately, to transformation. So anyway, that's just so in a sense, one of the conclusions I've come to in the research is, the talk of, if you will, it's better to collapse or, revolution. I think that's a scary proposition because it seems like the road to transformation is the more gradual one. So we'll see. Okay.
Could I just add before you move on to the
Sure,
next
sure.
slide? You haven't mentioned the psychological dimension. And I think as an organizational psychologist, when I think about giving people the option of not working, for example,
Mm,
we need to work. There's something that is inherently important to nourishing our soul, to our sense of having a purpose in life.
mm,
And so take it all away.
mhm.
Psychologically speaking, this could create problems. At the same time, as we move towards collapse, it could be that psychological dimension that could give us the impetus and the innovative capacity to push through. So that's sort of, even though I'm a believer in collapse, that's sort of where I come up against a brick wall. Humanity sometimes surprises us.
Indeed, indeed. Oh, very, good. So these are the kinds of conversations I'm glad that we need to have, and I'm glad that we're having it. Thank you. Let's go ahead and get into the images here. We'll probably just I want to introduce them, and maybe I'll pose a few questions, and we'll just rather than break out, maybe we'll just talk in the larger group. So that seems to be working fine. So if we go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about the first image, the circular commons. And again, that is the environmentally driven image of the future, if you will. And I chose circular. We started out calling it sustainable commons, and I kind of felt like sustainability, the concept of sustainability, while a great concept, has been kind of co-opted. I don't know if that's the right word. And that the circular idea, I think it's a refreshing take. It's kind of an evolution. And I just think the principle of reuse, right, or designing for less, reusing what we have, it's a brilliant concept. And I think it has popular appeal. And it's combined with commons. And, we don't want to get into the historical discussion here. We don't have time. But this idea that private is always better is a relatively newer idea, and that historically we held property resources in common. So it's not a completely new concept to move back to a more commons-based approach to how we manage access to resources and so on. So I think those two together, the circular commons, is kind of an idea of what that approach might look like. What I wanted to call, so you see some of the bullet points here. The one that I would like to just mention a little bit more here for your pleasure, I hope, is the emergence of the idea of degrowth. And when I first was doing the research, it was very fringy. Very few people were talking about seriously about the idea of degrowth as a strategy or as a policy or whatever you want to call it. And I would say, oh, about 5 years ago, it kind of started, you started to see it in the scanning, and all of a sudden it started to pop up. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And, in the last couple of years, we've had a bestseller. Jason Hickel out of South Africa did a wonderful, he's in Spain now, but he did a wonderful book called Less is More. And then, sorry, the name escapes me, but another author from Japan had a best-selling book about degrowth. And again, I think it's one of those concepts that if you had mentioned degrowth 10 or 20 years ago, people would look at you like you're crazy. What? We have to grow. There's no question we must grow. And so I think it's been interesting to see this concept start. Now, it's certainly not in the mainstream yet, but it's at least on the edge. And I can mention it in a public talk and not, not have to leave the room, right? So it's been a very interesting, and I even though I think it's a very provocative concept, right? Because I think it's so ingrained in our in the being, right? That growth is what we must do. But I think we're finally getting to that point, like maybe this is something we could consider. So I would go back to the earlier conversation that we had about stagnation. Like, are we actually growing anyway? So maybe it's not as hard as we might have thought. And then we certainly saw, I mentioned the example of COVID, where when we stopped growing, the environment started to get a little bit better. So I wonder if this is a concept that maybe is not as shocking as it might have seemed 5 or even 10 years ago, that's worth of our debate. So if I could just, my own evolution, I remember, at first thinking, well, maybe we could do sustainable growth. And then kind of analyzing that and saying, well, I don't know about that. And then moving on, well, how about steady state growth? Herman Daly did a lot of work on that. And I'm like, well, I don't think it has enough appeal. I mean, I think the situation that we find ourselves in as we think about the next 20 years is, I think we need to be a little bit provocative and say degrowth is something we've got to seriously consider if we're going to get this environmental situation back in balance. So I think in this case, provocative is good, even though in general I will try to be balanced. So maybe I could ask the group. You can see that I put a few questions together, but I think maybe the first one, what does anybody have a kind of a gut reaction to the concept of degrowth itself? Is that something that we can imagine gaining some sort of widespread acceptance over the next 10 to 20 years, or is that something that you think it's too radical? Any thoughts?
Hola, bueno, aquí está hablando ahí de la peculiaridad ahí de un sistema de decrecimiento. Ahí y está hablando ahí de que pues se ha estado, hay un estigma alrededor de ello, am, que naturalmente pues siempre se ha estado implementando el sistema de que, no, se debe crecer económicamente, tal y tal y tal. Y ahora está planteando ahí, pues puede haber, o inclusive hay un crecimiento sustentable, ¿no? Igual ahí tenemos ahí unas, nos resguardamos ante eso. Pero aquí es donde plantea la idea de el decrecimiento como forma de sustentabilidad. ¿Creen que sea posible un mundo donde la crecimiento sea un modelo viable, factible para la nueva sociedad? ¿O cómo se sienten al respecto del tópico de crecimiento, ¿no? Porque por su estigma y qué sienten que tendría que realizarse para que pudiera ser aceptado dentro de esta sociedad postmoderna. Muchas gracias.
Doctor José Alarcón.
Yes, thank you. Well, in the first approach, I was not in favor of the growth. However, when I was talking to somebody who told me, look, if we all want to achieve a very high level of life, let's say, for example, we might all want to have a very big Argentina stake. That's something that everybody wants to have. But if we achieve to that, we will have to have so many cows that we will have a climate disaster. So if we just go to that same level of life, that wouldn't be achievable economically and for the planet, let's say. So I said, well, that makes sense. And it connected me to what you see in Wall Street, that everybody's just trying to grow and grow just for the sake of growing. And if you don't report growing, you are not doing the right thing. I think that's nonsense, because you go into very bad habits just to grow by itself. No, so I think it makes sense. Now, the key question is what model should we follow instead of just running like crazy for growing, no? And I think the community approach could be an answer, uh, not for everybody, but much more than we are doing it now, to teach the poor people that don't have capital how to make community and make a team and grow together. I think that's a key formula. So that those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Excellent. Oh, so you're evolving. I love that. I love it. Go ahead, Sergio, please. And we'll take maybe then with just last question, then we gotta move to the next one, please.
Gracias. Bueno, no pienso que la calidad de vida esté determinada porque se tenga mayor crecimiento, sino sobre todo, no es importante solamente lo que se tiene, sino qué se hace con lo que tiene, con lo que se tiene. Y me parece que la idea de sustentabilidad implica la sostenibilidad. Y eso quiere decir que implica tanto el decrecimiento como el crecimiento. Es decir, qué es lo que la sociedad en general puede ir determinando qué es lo necesario para tener una mejor calidad de vida. Vemos muchos jóvenes, por ejemplo, que ya no están en la idea básicamente del consumo, sino que, por ejemplo, ya hacen uso más, por ejemplo, de reciclar, de no estar por una aspiración así, digamos, ostentosa, de derroche, ¿no? Y de presunción de un estilo de vida en el que tenga más es es más exitoso y tiene una mejor vida, sino de aquellas personas que, por ejemplo, están optando tanto por su situación personal como una situación colectiva. Es decir, a mí me parece que siempre va a haber una combinación entre las soluciones de carácter privado y las soluciones de carácter colectivo, porque muchas cuestiones no se pueden resolver a nivel privado, tiene que ser una solución colectiva. Y entonces por eso depende de mucho de las políticas que se tomen en cuenta, como las políticas tanto financieras como industriales, como de fiscales, para ver qué tipo de situaciones. Y eso, para cerrar, queda implícito para mí en la cuestión de la sustentabilidad, que obviamente dicen, sí, bueno, ok, ¿qué tanto debemos de crecer? Y eso pues va a ser también determinado por cada uno de los países, ¿no? Por ejemplo, sencillamente también vemos ahora que dicen, no, a ver, eso del cambio climático son puras tonterías y yo voy a hacer y voy a regresar otra vez a reindustrializar a mi país. y voy a seguir todavía con el consumo de petróleo y etcétera, ¿no? Entonces esto es controvertido y va a ser esa lucha por la que se va dando cambio entre que tienen una posición y tienen otras posiciones contrarias o diferentes y depende de las políticas que lleven a cabo los que pueden tomar sobre todo las grandes decisiones y eso no quiere decir que de otra parte que la gente sea la que esté transformando fundamentalmente en su día a día sus formas de llevar a cabo su vida cotidiana. Gracias.
Okay. I think we can thank you very much for that. I think I got the gist of it. And one of the comments I might have is, the idea of this particular work was to say, the image is this sense gives us where do we want to end up? But then we have to get into the financial policies, the economic policies, how are we going to govern in it. So in the book, I don't get into a lot of detail on how we're going to do it. It's mostly, I think the first question is future, should we say, let's find out where do we want to go first, and then, how do we get there? So obviously there's a little bit of both of that at the same time, but I feel like we don't even know where we want to go. Let's figure that out first and then start to work on the very important questions of how do we get there. But let's go ahead and move on since we're losing our time here, and maybe we'll go to the next two and then have some questions. So we'll go ahead and skip that slide for now and move on to the next image, if you don't mind. Sure. Let's talk about the non-workers paradise. And I think Jan brought up a really good point earlier about, well, what will people do, all right? Don't we need work because it's vital to our soul? And I think the images that are the ideas that I found around the post-work society said we will still absolutely still do things that look like work, but we will not be dependent on those activities in order to earn a living, so to speak. And that would be the really significant shift. We still will do what we might say work-like activities, but right now you work because that's how we survive. And in that post-work future with the abundance, we would have, if you will, enough resources to enable us to choose how we wanted to spend our time. Now, that may sound very utopic, but if you believe the abundance and if you believe some of the trends underway, we could get to that point where we don't have to have a job in order to survive. But we will still absolutely do things that will seem very work. And if you think about it, I'm here in my university right now, right? And there are many things I love about being a futurist, but there are a lot of things I do not love about being a futurist, and that includes all the administration and all that kind of stuff that I would gladly let go. So I think the post-works is the non-workers paradise is just this idea that should we start to think about, and this goes back to like the point Sergio was raising, should we start to think about how do we get there? If this is a goal, if we said, boy, if we could figure out how to distribute globally, now that's a big problem, right? That's a big challenge. If we could figure out how to redistribute the wealth that is there right now, I mean, right now we have enough money, if you will, we have enough wealth globally for every single person on this earth to live at a decent standard of living if it was divided fairly. We could do it right now. But we've chosen not to, right? And it would be a very difficult thing to do. So it's not that we couldn't do it, but and so part of the challenge, and might be why some of the folks are in the values, like myself, are in that values kind of frame, that if our values shift in favor of that more equitable distribution, perhaps we can make it happen in the next 10 to 20 years. So that's really the key idea around the non-workers paradise. And I wanted to bring up a point that Christina raised in the chat about the need to change our business models. And I've given this talk to General Motors, and I've given it to packaging professionals. I've given it to a bunch of different, corporate groups. And you can see that, like, issues number 4, 5, and 6 talk about how do we change business models that are dependent on growth? It's almost an assumption that we have to grow, as we've been taught this in business school, right? And so there is a lot of rethinking that we have to do if we're going to make this transition. And I think, like, one of the things we see in many business approaches, right, is that we always try to, develop our premium category, right? Because that's where we make the most money. So how can we find ways to charge more and more and more, right? Whereas in talking to the packaging group, right, and I said, well, if you could figure out a way that we could distribute bulk foods, we all know that that's the, in a sense, that's the most efficient or the least wasteful way to do it. But instead, we have these elaborate single-serve packages, which make the most money, right? But it's really not good for the planet. It's not a sound use of resources, right? So can we think about a way, how do we move to, if you will, systems and approaches that are more beneficial to the planet, to the people, and do that in a way that makes some kind of economic business sense. So there are problems that need to be solved, right? But if we agree that we want to move in a direction towards greater equity, towards less stress in the environment, then that changes the priorities that the goals that we pursue as we develop our business models. So thank you for pointing that out, Christina. So let's move to the next slide here, and and then I'll pause for questions. One more, if you don't mind. Yes, let's go to the third image, tech-led abundance. And I mentioned there are fairly developed images of this. We've probably all seen Kurzweil's singularity, or we've probably heard of that. We may have heard of Diamandis and his abundance, right? So these are images of the future that are out there. Personally, I'm a little afraid of these images because I feel like they are very much a part of the capitalist system, right? And the idea is that technology is produced by entrepreneurs, and that entrepreneurs, therefore, should, if you will, get the money. So we have these obscene amounts of wealth concentrated amongst if you will, a small group of technology entrepreneurs and pioneers. And in that sort of post-capitalist context, that's not going to work. But how do we get that framing of, entrepreneurs get to keep all the money to more of a more equitable distribution? And I don't know if some of you might be familiar with Sam Altman in the US. He's the founder of OpenAI, one of the big AI companies. And his initial business model was, we want to, if you will, we're going to use all this AI to give it away freely to create open access to all of the world's information. That was the original intent of his business. And a couple of years later, he's like, well, we're not making any money, so we're going to have to start charging. And now it's just another business scam, if you will. But the original intent was, we're going to give it away. So that idea is out there. Now, again, in fairness to him, you can understand that the pressure of this system is you've got to find out a way to make money or you don't survive. So now, whether it was a cynical attempt on his part, I don't know. But you can see that pressure in this system, if you don't find a way to make money, it's really hard to survive. So that's why, that's that choice that we have to make. If we want to move to a different system, we're going to have to really make some significant adjustments. So I think that's really the kind of the key challenge of the tech-led abundance is not, can it do it? I think it can, but can we distribute that abundance in a more useful way? So let me pause there. I have like a little bit of I have a slide that I can use to wrap up, but I wanted to give a chance for any further questions on either the non-workers paradise or tech-led abundance, or any comments, questions around those two images.
Pues se busca ahorita un tiempo ahí de preguntas. Ahí si gustan ahí exiliar alguna pregunta acerca de estas tres maneras de los nuevos horizontes, ¿no? Acerca de, pues, cómo se podría ver el mundo ahí liderado por la tecnología, ¿no? La abundancia de esta, cómo se podría ver ahí por medio de, creo que era el decrecimiento, am, y también de la equidad, la igualdad. Y bueno, pues sí, se busca ahí plantear algunas preguntas que se hayan culminado a lo largo de la sesión. Entonces, pues ahorita es el momento. Muchas gracias.
Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions?
El doctor José Alarcón, de nuevo, por favor.
Andy, my reaction is that I think that the image at the end we will have a little bit of these three images because they all have, and you have mentioned that, of course.
Yes.
I agree with that. Uh, the the path to it, that's a challenge, certainly, and you mentioned that. There is a book that I don't know if you have read it by, that is 10 Years to Midnight by Blair Shepard.
Nice.
Uh, and he works a lot. That's one of the few books that talks about how.
Okay.
In a very, it's 10 Years to Midnight by Blair Shepard. It's a 2020 year book. Blair used to be the strategy, the global strategy partner for PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is the firm which I am a retired partner. So he talks about having a change of model in three aspects. One is going from local to global instead of the globalization paradigm, is finding identity in the communities and putting that identity, give that identity to the world, and then bring the world to your community. That's the first approach. The second is to recover the trust in institutions. And finally, he talks about something like the social value of innovation. So that is where technology comes. And then at the center of because this is like a triangle, and then at the center of the triangle is the profile of the new leaders that should lead us to this new world, let's say. No? And he talks about some characteristics at solving some paradigms there. So I will argue that there is a very useful work from Blair Shepard that could be taken into account. That's it for my contribution. Thanks.
Thank you. I put the link into the chat. I think that sounds like a great book. There's so many. I have a stack this high of books that I need to get to. And that's, that's interesting, right? That we're finally starting to have some interesting discussions. Although I will say that more of those books in the stack are about the collapse, less about the other side of that. All right, well, if we can go ahead, I think I have one more slide to kind of wrap up the kind of the story here. If we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, there it is. This is the one. Let's stop right here because I think this is one of my favorite slides from Donella Meadows. I mentioned that The Image of the Future was the second book I read. The first one I read was Limits to Growth. And I've read all of the Limits to Growth updates. And I just love Donella Meadows and the whole team that put together that work. But anyway, she had a very nice article where maybe you've seen it, where she said, somebody asked her basically like, so out of all these years of doing systems thinking, what do you think are the most effective ways to change a system? And she came up with this list of 9, and I put them into 3 buckets, if you will. And so the first bucket is if you want to change a system, one of the things you can do is change the numbers, the metrics, the measures, the rates. Now, that's relatively easy to do. However, it's not all that effective in changing a system. It helps, but only helps a little bit. Okay? But people, she says, most of the time, executives and leaders will spend their time on this one because you can do it. It's easier to do, right? More effective, but harder to do, is you change the rules of the system. Now, when we start to influence the rules, how the systems work, the regulations, the relationships, we start to influence the structure of the system. Aha, now things start to happen. However, it's very hard to do. Very hard to do. And you get down to the bottom. What's the most effective way to change a system? You change the mind of the people in the system. But that is very, very hard to do. And we talked in the beginning about the value shift data. Now that's the value shifts that's happening and the data that supports that. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is that those value shifts they're very slow. Very slow. It takes a long time. And when I thought about the time frame for this work, one of the reasons that I chose 20 to 30 years for this shift, even though I believe we're in a pretty urgent crisis right now, it's just the mindset to change the business models, to change the policies, to change distribution. I mean, that's such a radical shift from where we are today that I think it's going to take us. It may. I hope it's a decade. Maybe it's two. I hope it's not three. But I really now the other thing that Meadow says and totally believe is like that doesn't mean we should do all three. We should do all three. We should be working. We should, if you will, fix the numbers to the extent we can. We should work on the rules. We should work on the mindset, but we got to do all of those things kind of at the same time. And one of the things that I always like to put back to the audience is, if you're a believer that we need to make these changes, where do you feel like you can make that influence? Where's the particular skill set or where's the energy that you have in terms of changing the system? Are you a metrics person? Are you a rules person? Or are you a mindset? Now, granted, we can do all three, but we we may have a particular interest or skill in one or the other. So I will leave that kind of conclusion with you and pause here and maybe give Guillermina and Rosario a chance to close out. And by the way, I wanted to special thanks to Rosario for arranging this whole opportunity to chat with you.
Ok. Rosario parece que todavía no se ha compuesto su audio. No sé si ya esté listo su audio. Ajá. Ok. Bueno, pues realmente nos pones a reflexionar bastante y bueno, a mí me ha evocado el síndrome del Titanic, ¿sí? ¿De qué sirve saber que vas a chocar contra un iceberg si no puedes evitar la colisión? Y creo que si vamos hacia el colapso, los que trabajamos futuro o prospectiva, tenemos que evitar la colisión. Precisamente tenemos que empezar a trabajar esas estrategias que nos permitan evitar la colisión y creo que por ahí has estado muy atinado en darnos reflexiones con respecto a esta situación. Muchísimas gracias, Andy. Te agradecemos muchísimo. Le agradecemos a Rosario, que trabajó y sufrió también bastante con la parte tecnológica, a Sash, que también nos empezó a ayudar. Muchísimas gracias a todos y nos vemos la próxima semana. Y claro, estaremos aquí, seguiremos con la discusión. Socialismo y fascismo es el tema de la próxima semana con el doctor Leonel Corona. Muchísimas gracias. Andy, gracias.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time and the comments. Very, very kind of you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Andy.
Bye.
Hugs.
Bye-bye, Andy. Yeah, thank you very much. Great
All
talk.
right.
Okay?
Yes.
Great,
Ujú.
great.
All right.
Francisco, ya,
Thank you very much, sir, Professor.
Ajá.
Luego,
Francisco, hoy creo que ya salió, ¿verdad?
no estoy aquí. ¿Por qué, doctora?
Ah, te quería decir que cerraras como siempre
Sí,
teníamos problemas con la tecnología.
sí.
No te había visto. Qué barbaridad está ahorita.
No, no importa.
Pero,
Pero ha sido un excelente evento.
ujú,
Pero ha dejado sobre la mesa el profesor Andy un conjunto muy amplio de rutas a seguir y trabajar en ellas.
ujú. Eso es muy padre, sí, efectivamente.
Muy
Y,
bien.
y fue muy difícil ahora porque teníamos muchos problemas para ver si se podía traducir o no.
Sí.
Finalmente se encontró esta opción de Google para no desgastar a nuestros colegas. Entonces, por eso veías que de repente Jan traducía, de repente
No.
el primo de Rosario, de repente estuvo un poco difícil esta parte, pero
Sí.
eso nos da el lugar para saber por dónde podemos ir en este tipo
Dejó
de
mucho material. Yo creo
colegas.
que
Exacto.
una sesión que revisara el conjunto de temas propuestos por el profesor sería bueno, ¿eh? Porque se puede armar inclusive una agenda. Pero en fin, y además, bueno, la ventaja es el buen acento, la claridad del hablante, de Andy, del profesor Andy, que lo
Ujú.
hizo con toda claridad y precisión y fue muy directo en sus planteamientos.
Así es, así es. Y sí,
Eh,
efectivamente, cada lámina tiene que revisarse con detalle, ¿verdad?
sí,
No,
que logré ver
pero
un poco que creo que dijeron en el chat que iban a compartir las láminas, ¿no?
sí, de todos modos, yo lo comento con Melanie, si es posible que estén visibles,
Sí.
bien visibles en el YouTube, ¿verdad? Si
Sí.
no, sí
En
las
el,
podemos compartir.
en el chat, ¿no? En el chat del seminario de prospectiva, en el WhatsApp.
Ah, en el WhatsApp, ok, ajá.
Sí.
Sí se
Bueno.
puede, en el WhatsApp, ¿cómo no? Claro que sí.
Sí, yo tenía, iba a plantear algunos puntos a
Sí,
partir de la exposición, pero bueno, ya terminó el profesor, el doctor ya terminó, y bueno,
sí.
yo la tarea que queda es esa, la que le estoy señalando.
¡Ay, qué barbaridad! Bueno, sí, sí, sí. Sí, lo vamos a manejar.
Muy bien,
Este,
doctor.
al contrario, una disculpa, Francisco,
No,
pero
de ninguna manera, todo está bien.
vamos, sí,
Saludos a
sí.
Sergio, que tuvo una intervención muy
Gracias.
buena. Hasta luego.
Gracias,
Abrazo. Dios.
gracias. Hasta luego. Nos estamos viendo. Bye.